It is a truth universally acknowledged that a duke in possession of a great fortune must be in want of a wife, a sentiment that seemed to animate every ambitious mother in London. It was a truth, however, that Duke Arthur Beaumont, the object of this universal desire, regarded as a universal curse. His study was a cage of his own making, all dark mahogany and stiff leather, a fortress against a world that demanded he perform his final, most odious duty. He stood at the window, not seeing the carriages that rattled past his Mayfair townhouse, but the grim face of his solicitor, who had departed only moments before. "The trustees affirm, Your Grace. An engagement must be announced by the end of the season."
The words were an ultimatum, a declaration of war.
A cage, Arthur thought, his jaw so tight it ached. They want to lock me in a cage and call it a family. He saw it with perfect, painful clarity, a flash of memory from his childhood, his mother's vibrant eyes slowly turning to glass over years of silent, elegant dinners with his father. A man of duty, a man of stone, a man who had provided his wife with everything but a reason to live. Arthur had his father's jaw, his father's title, his father's damnable control. He would not, could not, inflict that same legacy of quiet heartbreak upon some unsuspecting woman. He would not become that man. He turned from the window, his gaze falling upon the evening's invitation, lying like a death warrant on his desk. Lady Danbury's annual ball, the very heart of the marriage mart. A cold, ruthless idea began to form, a strategy born of pure desperation. If they demanded he play the game, he would play it by a set of rules they could not possibly comprehend. He was not going to the ball to find a wife. He was going to find a weapon. Across the city, in a townhouse that held the ghost of a fortune rather than the weight of one, Lady Leonora Scott was fastening the last pearl button on her younger sister's glove. "Do you think Lord Ashworth will be there?" Frances asked, her voice a breathless whisper of excitement. At 17, the world was still a place of infinite possibility. "I am certain of it," Leonora said, her smile feeling brittle on her lips. She adjusted a stray curl on her sister's head, avoiding the sight of their mother, who was watching them with a hawk's eye from the doorway. "The lace on your gown is slightly frayed, Leonora," her mother noted, her voice thin with a familiar, anxious pride. "One must hope no one looks too closely." Everyone is always looking closely, Leonora thought. A servant entered with the Evening Post on a silver tray that was in dire need of polishing. Leonora's eyes snagged on a stark, plain envelope tucked between the invitations. She took it before her mother could, her fingers suddenly cold. "A bill for the florist, I imagine," she said lightly, excusing herself. In the privacy of her room, she broke the seal. The words were simple, black and white, and utterly final. A final notice from her late father's creditors. They required payment within the month. The alternative was the seizure of their country estate, the only real home she had ever known. The air left her lungs. Failure. Ruin. The image of Frances's hopeful face flashed in her mind, and something inside Leonora hardened. She would not let that light in her sister's eyes be extinguished. She folded the letter, her hands perfectly steady. She walked to her mirror and looked at the woman who stared back. The elegant gown was armor. The serene expression was a mask. The ballroom was not a party, it was a battlefield. And this was her last stand. She was not hunting for a husband. She was hunting for a savior. The heat and noise of the Danbury ball struck Arthur the moment he entered. He was an iceberg in a warm sea, the crowd parting before him with a mixture of awe and fear. His gaze swept the room with the detached analysis of a predator. He saw the hopeful debutantes, their faces painted with false smiles. He saw the ambitious mothers, their eyes glinting with calculation. He dismissed them all. He was looking for something else, someone else. And then he saw her, Lady Leonora Scott. He knew her name. He knew her father, the late Earl, had left his accounts in a shambles. But he had never truly seen her before. She was standing near a pillar, her posture radiating a calm elegance that was completely at odds with the man cornering her, a vile baron known for collecting debts and distressed ladies with equal, leering enthusiasm. Arthur watched. He saw the baron lean in, his voice a low, proprietary murmur. He saw the slight, almost imperceptible stiffening of her spine. He saw the look in her eyes as she stared past the baron's shoulder. Not fear, not flirtation, but the cold, hard glint of a soldier backed against a wall. And in that instant, Arthur's entire strategy clicked into place with chilling certainty. There, the perfect weapon, the perfect shield. A woman whose quiet desperation was a mirror to his own. He began to move, a shark gliding through unsuspecting waters. The baron was still speaking, his hand moving to rest on Leonora's arm. She flinched. Arthur arrived at her side, his presence a sudden, cold authority that made both of them look up. The baron's face curdled with annoyance. Leonora's expression was one of trapped confusion. Arthur ignored the baron completely, his eyes locking with Leonora's. He gave a slight, formal bow, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the noise of the ballroom. "Forgive my interruption, Baron," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "But I believe Lady Leonora promised me this dance." For a disorienting moment, Leonora was certain she had imagined it. The Duke of Beaumont's voice, a low, resonant sound that seemed to absorb all the noise around it, was so utterly out of place in her small, terrifying world that it could not possibly be real. But the Baron had heard it too. His fleshy face, which had been leering an inch from hers, went rigid. He turned, his expression curdling from predatory confidence to pure, sputtering indignation as he took in the Duke's tall, imposing frame. "Your Grace," the Baron stammered, his grip on Leonora's arm finally falling away. "I believe Lady Leonora and I were in the midst of a private conversation." Arthur's gaze remained fixed on Leonora, as if the Baron were nothing more than a buzzing insect. "All the more reason for me to claim my dance," he stated, the words an iron command wrapped in the thinnest layer of civility. He extended a gloved hand to her. Not a request, a summons. Leonora's mind raced. A lie. A blatant, public lie. But to contradict a duke was social suicide. To remain with the Baron was a slower, more certain ruin. She had been trapped between a rock and a hard place, and a mountain had just appeared to block one of the paths. She had no choice but to walk the other. With a silent, graceful nod that betrayed none of the frantic panic seizing her heart, she placed her trembling fingers into his. His grip was firm, cool, and instantly possessive. He led her toward the dance floor. The journey felt a mile long. A ripple of whispers followed them, the eyes of the entire ton, a physical weight on her back. She was acutely aware of the warmth of his hand, steady and proprietary at the small of her back. This was not a rescue. This felt like a capture. The orchestra began a waltz, and he swept her into the motion with an expert's ease. They were a perfect picture of aristocratic grace, a duke and a lady turning elegantly under the glittering chandeliers. It was a beautiful lie. What does he want? The question screamed in her mind. He saw my desperation. The thought was mortifying. It made her a charity case. It made her weak. "Your Grace," she said, her voice a quiet rebellion, forcing herself to meet his piercing gaze. "I must confess, my memory fails me." I do not recall promising you this dance. A flicker of something, not surprise, but perhaps approval, moved in the depths of his cool eyes. An unfortunate oversight, he replied, his voice a low murmur meant for her alone. One I felt compelled to correct. He guided her through a turn, their bodies moving closer for a moment. Baron Hemlock is not known for his pleasant company. You seemed indisposed. He had seen everything. The knowledge stripped her bare. She felt a flush of shame, followed by a cold spike of fear. This man, this powerful, unreadable duke, had witnessed her ultimate vulnerability. She was now in his debt. I am grateful for your timely intervention, she said, the formal words tasting like ash in her mouth. I am not in the habit of intervening, Lady Leonora, he countered smoothly, his expression giving nothing away. I am in the habit of securing assets. Your predicament simply coincided with a business opportunity I wish to discuss. The music swelled, a poignant, romantic melody that was a mockery of the cold, hard bargain being struck in its midst. The dance was a cage, and he was the one holding the key. As the final notes of the waltz began to fade, she expected him to release her, to deliver her back to the edge of the ballroom and disappear. He did not. His hand remained firmly on hers. A word in private, he said, his voice leaving no room for refusal. On the terrace, he did not lead her back to the throng of chaperones and gossiping matriarchs. Instead, he guided her through a set of glass doors onto a stone terrace, the cool night air a shocking contrast to the stifling heat of the ballroom. The music of the orchestra was softer here, a distant, melancholy sound. They were alone. He released her hand, and the loss of contact was a jolt. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight, his tall frame a dark silhouette against the glittering party inside. You mentioned a business opportunity, Your Grace, Leonora said, her voice steadier than she felt. She would not show him the fear that was coiling in her stomach. She would meet this lion head-on. I did, he said, his tone devoid of any warmth. I find myself in need of a fiancé for the remainder of the season. A temporary arrangement, a performance, if you will. Leonora stared at him, certain she had misheard. Performance? You will play the part of the adoring woman who has captured the heart of the unobtainable duke, he stated, the words clipped and precise. You will attend events on my arm. You will dance with me when required. You will smile demurely. In return, your association with me will elevate your status beyond measure. When our arrangement concludes at the end of the season, you will be the most sought-after lady in London. Every titled man with a fortune will be lining up to claim the woman who nearly became a duchess. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the proposal stole her breath. It was scandalous. It was insulting. And it was brilliant. Her mind, a flurry of panic just moments before, sharpened to a razor's edge. The letter from the creditors. Francis. Her home. And why me? She asked, her voice quiet and sharp. Surely there are a dozen ladies inside who would leap at such an offer, no performance necessary. Because they would believe it to be real, he said, taking a step closer. The moonlight caught the sharp planes of his face. They are sentimental fools raised on fairy tales. I require a partner. Not a starry-eyed girl. When I saw you tonight, Lady Leonora, I saw a woman who understands the value of a practical solution. A woman, I believe, who will not confuse a business contract with matters of the heart. His words were a challenge and a brutal assessment. He was right. She had murdered her own fairy tales. She had to. This is a deal with the devil, a small, terrified voice whispered in her mind. But he is the only one offering salvation, the soldier replied. She lifted her chin, meeting his cold gaze with a coldness of her own. You mentioned this would be mutually beneficial. Such a service would command a high price. He gave a single curt nod, respecting the transactional nature of her question. Your late father's debts. All of them. They will be settled discreetly. There it was. Not just a shield, but a sword. Not just a reprieve, but a rescue. The cost was her reputation, her pride, and a season spent in the company of this cold, calculating man. It was no cost at all. She took a deep, steadying breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. On one condition, Your Grace. A flicker of surprise. He had not expected a counteroffer. And what is that? In public, I may be your adoring fiancé, she said, her voice like ice. But in private, we are partners in a business transaction. Nothing more. You will not treat me as a possession. You will treat me as an equal. He stared at her for a long, silent moment, the distant music drifting between them. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips for the first time. It did not reach his eyes. As you wish, Lady Leonora, he said. It seems I chose my partner well. A month passed in a blur of public adoration and private, chilling distance. The engagement of the Iron Duke to the quietly intelligent Lady Leonora Scott was the scandal and the triumph of the season. As promised, the Tun was ablaze. Arthur was left blessedly alone by matchmaking mothers, and Leonora's family was, for the first time in years, safe. The arrangement was a resounding success. In public, he was the attentive fiancé. In private, he was her business partner, their conversations limited to schedules and strategy. They were exquisite actors, and Leonora was beginning to believe she might actually survive the performance with her heart intact. The illusion held until a weekend party at the Marquess of Salisbury's country estate. Surrounded by the Tun for 3 straight days, the pressure of their roles was immense. Needing a moment's respite, Leonora slipped away from a crowded afternoon tea, seeking the quiet of a wooded path that bordered the estate. She had not been walking for more than 10 minutes when the sound of footsteps on the path behind her made her turn. It was Arthur. It is unwise to wander off alone, Lady Leonora, he said, his tone as formal as ever. But there was a hard edge to it she had not heard before. Your absence was noted. I needed a moment of quiet, she replied, lifting her chin. Even a fiancé for hire is allowed that, I believe. His jaw tightened. Before he could respond, a sudden, violent gust of wind tore through the trees, and the sky, which had been a placid grey, turned a bruised purple. A fat drop of rain hit Leonora's cheek, then another. Within seconds, the heavens opened in a torrential downpour, soaking them both to the bone. This way, he commanded, taking her arm and pulling her off the path and deeper into the woods. They ran, rain plastering her hair to her face and her dress to her legs, until he guided her toward a small, stone structure half hidden by ivy. An old gamekeeper's cottage. Inside, it was one small, dusty room. The air was cold and damp. The storm raged outside, cutting them off from the world. The Duke and his pretend fiancée were gone. There was only a man and a woman, drenched and shivering in a tiny, forgotten hut. Without a word, Arthur moved with a raw competence she'd never seen, finding wood and an old flint box to coax a small, struggling fire to life on the hearth. She huddled near the growing warmth, her teeth chattering. He shrugged off his own soaked coat and, without looking at her, held it out. You'll catch your death, he said gruffly. As the fire grew, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls, an unfamiliar silence settled between them. The usual rules and roles of London society were meaningless here. "Does the title ever feel less like a privilege and more like a cage, Your Grace?" Leonora asked, her voice barely a whisper. Arthur stared into the flames, the question hanging in the air. Finally, he gave her a piece of the truth. "A cage has bars, you can see," he said, his voice a low, aching tone. "My inheritance is more like a ghost. I live in my father's house, with my father's title and my father's nature." He turned to her, his eyes dark with a pain she had never imagined. "My greatest fear, Lady Leonora, is that I am incapable of being anything more than he was. A man of duty, stone, and silence." The raw confession silenced the storm in her own heart. He had shown her his deepest wound. She had to show him hers. "My inheritance is also a ghost, Your Grace," she whispered, her voice matching his aching tone. "The ghost of my father's debts. My greatest fear is the face of my sister, Frances, when I have to tell her there will be no season for her. My fear is that my best will not be good enough, and I will have to watch my family fall into ruin because I failed them." The air was thick with their shared vulnerability. He was not the Iron Duke. She was not the pragmatic lady. They were two people, defined by their fears. Slowly, he reached for her, cupping her face in his hands. His touch was warm and gentle. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time she felt truly seen. He whispered her name, "Leonora," and then he kissed her. It was a quiet, questioning kiss, a moment of pure, unplanned discovery. All the contracts, all the rules, all the fears dissolved into a single, shared warmth against the cold of the storm. When he pulled away, he looked utterly stunned by his own actions. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. Leonora couldn't speak. She could only pull the rough blanket she'd found tighter around her shoulders, her heart hammering against her ribs, her face flushed. The soldier was gone. In her place was someone shy, vulnerable, and terrified by the jolt of feeling that had just passed between them. A profound, charged, and deeply awkward silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain on the roof. Returning to London was like stepping back into a play after having forgotten all one's lines. The kiss in the cottage had not been spoken of again. It existed between them like a ghost, a shared, secret memory that made their public performance of courtship an exercise in exquisite torture. The easy, professional distance they once had was gone, replaced by a tense, hyper-awareness of every glance, every accidental brush of their hands. The arrangement, to the outside world, continued to be a triumph. To Arthur and Leonora, it was beginning to feel like a trap of their own making. It was at a musicale in the Countess of Pembroke's lavish home that the first crack in their fragile truce appeared. Leonora, having successfully extricated herself from Arthur's brooding silence, found herself in a surprisingly pleasant conversation with Lord Lawrence. He was a kind, intelligent Marquess, with gentle eyes, and he spoke to her not as the Duke's property, but as a woman with a mind of her own. For the first time in weeks, a genuine, unforced laugh escaped her lips. From across the room, Arthur saw it. He saw the way her face lit up, a warmth he had only ever seen once before, illuminated by firelight in a lonely cottage. He saw the easy admiration in the Marquess's eyes. This was the plan. This was the intended outcome, a respectable, worthy suitor for Leonora. A success. So why did the sight of it feel like a betrayal? Why did a cold, possessive rage, utterly illogical and terrifyingly primal, coil in his gut? He is precisely the sort of man she should marry, the logical part of his mind stated. I want to break his jaw, was the only reply. He was losing control. He moved before the thought was even complete. His approach was a sudden drop in temperature, silencing the light-hearted conversation instantly. Lord Lawrence, to his credit, did not flinch, merely offering a polite nod. Your Grace, Lawrence said. Arthur's eyes were only for Leonora. Lawrence, he said, his voice a blade wrapped in velvet, I trust you will forgive me for reclaiming my fiancée. We have a matter to discuss with our hostess. It was a blatant dismissal. Leonora felt a hot flush of embarrassment and anger. She had been handled, moved like a chess piece, in a game whose rules he kept changing. She offered Lord Lawrence a tight, apologetic smile before allowing Arthur to steer her away by the elbow, his grip just a fraction too firm. Once they were in a secluded alcove, hidden from view by a large fern, she pulled her arm free. What precisely was that? She demanded, her voice a furious whisper. Lord Lawrence is exactly the kind of gentleman our arrangement was meant to attract. Were you actively trying to ruin the opportunity? He stared down at her, his face a cold, impenetrable mask. He could not tell her the truth, that the sight of her smiling at another man was an agony he had not anticipated. That his control, the one thing he valued above all else, was shattering. So he deflected, using cruelty as a shield. You appeared to be forgetting your role, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Your laughter was unseemly. A future duchess should command more restraint. The word struck her like a physical blow. It was not just an insult, it was a reminder of her position. She was hired help, an actress, and she had just been reprimanded by her employer for enjoying herself. The warmth of the evening vanished, replaced by a familiar, chilling cold. The carriage ride home from the musicale was a masterclass in silence. It was a living, breathing thing. A third passenger in the cab that filled the space between them with the weight of unspoken accusations. Leonora sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing gaslights that painted fleeting golden stripes across her silk gown. She would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. He calls me his partner and treats me like a disobedient servant, she thought, the anger a clean, hard flame in her chest. He saw me happy for a moment and had to crush it. The kiss in the cottage had been a lie, a moment of weakness. This man, this Duke of stone and ice, was exactly who she had first thought him to be. A tool to be used, a monster to be endured. Nothing more. Across from her, Arthur felt the self-loathing rise in him like bile. The echo of his own cruel words, unseemly restraint, mocked him. He had sounded exactly like his father, cold, tyrannical, and utterly dismissive. He hadn't said what he'd truly meant. He couldn't. He couldn't say that the sound of her genuine laughter, directed at another man, had felt like a physical theft. He couldn't say that the sight of Lord Lawrence looking at her with open admiration had ignited a possessiveness so savage it had terrified him. This feeling was not the logical byproduct of a business arrangement. It was a disease, a fever in his blood that was burning away his legendary control, leaving him raw and exposed. He had wounded her, not to maintain the integrity of their bargain, but because he was a jealous, selfish fool. The realization was its own kind of hell. The following week was a study in strained civility. Their public appearances became flawless, chilling performances. To the ton, the Duke and his fiancée had an air of regal seriousness about them. But to anyone watching closely, the warmth was gone. At the opera, he was impeccably attentive, yet his hand never lingered on hers. During a walk in the park, they were a perfect portrait of a couple, but they exchanged no more than a dozen words, their gazes fixed anywhere but on each other. Lord Lawrence, ever the gentleman, attempted to approach Leonora at a garden party, only to find the Duke suddenly at her side, his presence an impenetrable wall. The tension simmered, a pot left on the boil for far too long, until the night of the Venetian masquerade ball at Vauxhall Gardens. The gardens were a world of fantasy and intrigue, a chaotic, glittering labyrinth of flickering lanterns, hidden grottos, and masked revellers. The anonymity of the masks was a heady, dangerous freedom. Behind a simple black domino mask, Leonora felt a flicker of her old self, the woman who existed before debts and desperate bargains. Arthur, in a severe, dark mask that seemed only to accentuate the sharp line of his jaw, was a silent, watchful shadow at her side. Feeling suffocated by his brooding presence, she excused herself. It was then that Lord Lawrence, masked as a Venetian nobleman, found her by a fountain. "My lady," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "I feared I would not have the chance to speak with you this evening." "And miss the chance to solve the great mystery of who is behind this mask," she countered, a spark of her old wit returning. He smiled, a genuine kind expression that was visible even with his mask. "I would know your voice anywhere, Lady Leonora." He asked for a dance, and for the first time she accepted without a second thought. In the swirling anonymity of the masked waltz, she let go. She laughed as Lawrence recounted a witty story, the sound clear and bright in the night air. For a few precious minutes, she wasn't a pretend fiancé or a family's savior. She was just a woman, enjoying a dance with a kind man. From the shadows of a colonnade, Arthur watched. He saw her head tilt back in laughter, a gesture of unguarded joy he had seen only for himself. He saw the way Lawrence's hand held hers, the easy intimacy of their conversation. The masks made it worse, transforming the scene into a secret, illicit rendezvous. The simmering jealousy of the past week erupted into a white-hot inferno. The last thread of his control snapped. He moved through the crowd, a predator cutting a path to its prey. He did not wait for the music to end. He simply took her arm. "This dance is mine," he said, his voice a low growl that was terrifyingly real. Lord Lawrence stepped back, stunned. Leonora was ripped from her moment of freedom, the fantasy shattering around her. "Your Grace, what is the meaning of this?" she hissed, as he pulled her away from the dance floor, away from the lanterns, and into the dark, tangled paths of a garden labyrinth. He dragged her to a stop in a secluded alcove, moonlight filtering through the leaves above, dappling them in silver and shadow. "The meaning," he said, his chest heaving, "is that you are my fiancé. You will not flaunt yourself with other men." "Flaunt myself?" she cried, ripping her arm from his grasp. "I was having a conversation. I was performing the very role you hired me for, securing the interest of respectable men." "Do you take me for a fool?" he snarled, backing her against a stone wall. "That was not a performance. You were enjoying yourself. Is that a crime now?" She shot back, her own fury rising to meet his. "Am I not permitted a single moment of genuine feeling? You say I forget my role, but you are the one who is constantly rewriting the script to suit your black moods." "Then let me make the terms clear," he growled, ripping his own mask from his face and throwing it to the ground. He braced his hands on the wall on either side of her head, caging her in. His eyes were blazing with a fire she had never seen before, a raw, possessive, and desperate fury. Before she could speak, before she could even breathe, his mouth crashed down on hers. This was not the gentle, questioning kiss from the cottage. This was a storm. It was a kiss born of rage and jealousy, a desperate, punishing attempt to claim and to own. It was a raw confession of everything he could not say, a brand of possession meant to erase the memory of any other man. It shattered every rule of their agreement, every wall of his control, every defense she had left. The kiss ended as abruptly as it began. He pulled back, breathing heavily, his eyes still wild. They stared at each other in the moonlit silence, both breathless, both utterly shocked. The air crackled with the enormity of what had just happened. He had not acted as her employer, nor as her pretend fiancé. He had acted as a man consumed by a feeling he could no longer control, and in doing so, he had just shown her his entire hand. The silence that followed them back into the gardens, and then into the suffocating privacy of the carriage, was nothing like the cold, angry quiet of the week before. This was a silence born of pure, unadulterated shock. The violence of his kiss had burned away the anger, leaving them both exposed and trembling in its wake. Leonora sat across from him, her fingers lightly pressed to her lips, her mind a maelstrom of confusion. The kiss had been a punishment, an act of possession, but underneath the fury she had felt something else, a desperate, aching vulnerability that matched the confession he'd made in the cottage. He was not a man of stone. He was a man at war with himself. Arthur stared out the window, refusing to look at her. He was horrified. The control he had spent a lifetime perfecting had not just cracked, it had been utterly annihilated. He had behaved like a brute, a common ruffian driven by a base jealousy he couldn't govern. He had taken what he wanted, not as part of a bargain, but because he was desperate. He had shown her the chaotic, uncontrolled man beneath the ducal armor, and the shame of it was a physical weight. He expected her to recoil, to demand an end to their arrangement. When she remained silent, the weight of her quiet regard was somehow even more damning. The next morning, a small, perfect bouquet of violets arrived for her. There was no card. It was not the grand, impersonal gesture of a duke, but a quiet, almost shy apology. When they next met, at a diplomatic dinner, he was different. The cold distance was replaced by a quiet, watchful gravity. He stood a little closer to her in the reception line. He brought her a glass of champagne, remembering she preferred the drier vintage. He was, for the first time, not playing the part of a fiancé. He was simply there, with her. A few days later, a note arrived, requesting her presence at his townhouse to discuss the terms of their ongoing arrangement. She arrived expecting another tense business meeting, but he led her not to the formal receiving room, but to the library. It was a magnificent two-story room, smelling of old leather and beeswax, a deeply personal space that was the true heart of his home. "I have been reviewing the quarterly reports from the tenant farms on the northern estate," he said, gesturing to a large table covered in maps and ledgers. "The crop rotation system is inefficient. I'm considering a new approach." He began to explain his ideas, not as a duke giving a lecture, but as a man sharing his passion. He spoke of agriculture, of architecture, of his duty not just to his title, but to the thousands of people who depended on his land. He treated her not as a decorative accessory, but as an intellectual equal. He asked for her opinion, and when she offered a surprisingly sharp insight about the logistics of transporting goods, he listened with a genuine, focused intensity that was more intoxicating than any compliment. They talked for hours. The sun set, casting long shadows through the tall windows, and a servant had to enter to light the lamps. For the first time, they were not Lord Arthur Beaumont and Lady Leonora Scott. They were Arthur and Leonora. She saw the brilliant, burdened man who cared deeply for his legacy. He saw the sharp, compassionate woman who saw the world with a clarity he'd never encountered. A fragile, tentative bridge was being built between them, a secret courtship hidden within the shell of their public lie. It was this growing intimacy, that would prove to be his undoing. A week later, they were walking in the private gardens behind his townhouse. It was a warm afternoon, and a genuine, easy smile had graced Leonora's lips as she recounted a witty, slightly scandalous story about her sister, Frances. The sound of her laughter, soft and real, struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow. It was beautiful. It was the sound of a happiness he was beginning to feel himself. And it terrified him. The image of her smiling face was instantly superimposed with a memory. His mother, sitting in a similar garden, her own smile faint and brittle, her eyes already holding the ghost of the woman she used to be. The two images merged, and a cold dread seized him. This was the trap. This happiness was the bait. The closer he allowed himself to get, the more devastating the inevitable ruin would be when she finally realized the truth of him, that he was a hollow man, his father's son, a gilded cage in human form. Leonora noticed the sudden shift, the way the light left his eyes. "Arthur?" she asked softly, the use of his given name still new and tentative on her tongue. "What is it?" He stopped walking, turning to her with an expression so bleak it made her heart ache. "This," he said, his voice rough. "Us. It cannot be what you think it is, Leonora." "And what do I think it is?" she asked, a knot of fear tightening in her chest. "You are starting to see a man who does not exist," he said, his words precise and cruel, meant to wound. "The man you see now is an illusion. The truth is the stone beneath. The truth is my father's son." He told her then, not the clipped version from the cottage, but the entire ugly story. He spoke of his mother's slow withering, of a house full of exquisite, beautiful things where no one ever touched, where silence was the only language of emotion. "I watched her fade," he confessed, his voice low and aching, "and I swore I would never be the cause of that kind of pain. I do not have it in me, Leonora. The warmth you feel is temporary. The core of me is cold. It is my inheritance." He looked at her, his eyes begging her to understand, to save herself from him. "I will honor our bargain. I will give you my name, my protection, and my fortune. It is a good contract." He took a step back, creating a chasm between them that felt 100 miles wide. "But do not ever make the mistake of asking for my heart," he said, his voice devastatingly final, "because it is not mine to give." The days that followed his confession were a special kind of hell. A cold war, fought in the silent, shared space of their carriage and across the glittering expanse of London's ballrooms. To the outside world, they were the picture of ducal propriety, a serious, devoted couple. But to Leonora, the man beside her had been replaced by a ghost. The tentative warmth, the shared glances, the quiet understanding, all of it had vanished, locked away behind the iron facade he now wore at all times. He was the Iron Duke again, in form and in function, and she was grieving for a man named Arthur, who, he had assured her, did not exist. She tried once to breach the wall. Was it all a lie, then? She asked him one evening as they sat in his library, the silence between them as thick as a shroud. In the cottage? He didn't even look up from the ledger he was studying. "It was a moment of weakness," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It will not be repeated." Leonora felt the hope she had been foolishly nurturing wither and die. She was a partner in a business contract. She had been a fool to ever think it could be anything more. She retreated into herself, her public smiles becoming as brittle and practiced as her mother's, her heart carefully shielded behind a wall of polite, icy grace. From his study window, Arthur watched her. He saw her one afternoon, walking in the garden with her sister, Frances, He saw the forced cheerfulness of her expression, the profound sadness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. He was already poisoning her. The ghost of his mother was everywhere now, in the quiet halls of his home, in the sad, beautiful face of the woman he loved. Loved. The word was a fire in his mind, one he had to extinguish. Later that week, at a garden party, he saw her speaking with Lord Lawrence. The good, kind Marquess looked at her with an expression of such open, uncomplicated affection that it was like a knife to Arthur's ribs. He can give her that, the torturous thought came, sharp and clear. He can give her a simple, warm heart. All I have is this shadow. To keep her is to cage her. To let her go is to set her free. Her hatred is a small price to pay for her life. In that moment, his terrible, twisted resolution hardened into place. He would not just push her away. He would perform a public surgery. He would cut her out of his life so cleanly and so cruelly that she would be forced to hate him. Her hatred would be her salvation. It was, he convinced himself, the only truly honourable act he had left. The perfect venue for this execution was, by a stroke of tragic irony, their own engagement ball. Hosted by his formidable grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, the Beaumont House ballroom had never looked more magnificent. It was a sea of glittering diamonds and rustling silk, a grand celebration of the match of the season. Leonora arrived in a gown of shimmering silver, a vision of ethereal beauty. She was the most envied woman in London, and the most miserable. She held on to one last desperate sliver of hope, that tonight, in the face of this grand public declaration, his walls might finally come down. Arthur greeted her with a chillingly perfect smile, and a cold, formal kiss to her gloved hand. He was the consummate host, the proud fiancé, and a complete stranger. Their first dance was a masterpiece of public performance and private agony. He held her with perfect propriety, his body rigid, his eyes looking straight through her. The evening wore on, an eternity of polite conversation and forced smiles. Finally, after supper, the moment came. A hush fell over the room as Arthur led Leonora to the centre of the floor. The orchestra quieted. Everyone leaned in, their faces beaming, ready for the loving toast, the public declaration of adoration. Arthur looked out over the sea of expectant faces, his own a mask of cool composure. "My lords, ladies, and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying with effortless authority to every corner of the vast room. "Thank you for joining my grandmother and me this evening to celebrate this occasion." He paused, letting the silence stretch. Then he turned to Leonora. His eyes were not cruel. They were empty. Utterly, terrifyingly empty. "It is with considerable thought," he continued, his voice steady, "that Lady Leonora and I have come to a mutual understanding. Our engagement is at an end." A collective, audible gasp swept through the ballroom. 100 fans froze mid-flutter. Leonora felt the blood drain from her face. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "Number." He was not finished. He lowered his voice, speaking for her alone, yet loud enough for the first few rows to hear every devastating word. "The arrangement has served its purpose. Your status is secured. You are now free to pursue other, more suitable attachments." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the edge of the room, where Lord Lawrence was staring, his face a picture of stunned disbelief. "I believe the Marquess is waiting." It was a public execution. He had not only broken her heart, he had publicly humiliated her. He had reduced every moment they had shared, every conversation, every laugh, every secret confession, every kiss, to a cold, calculated arrangement. He had branded her a commodity, and then cast her aside, pointing her toward the next buyer. He did not wait to see the aftermath of the bomb he had just detonated. Without another glance at her shattered face, he gave a curt, final bow to the stunned crowd, turned on his heel, and walked away. The iceberg Duke, his control perfectly, monstrously intact. He left her standing alone in the center of the silent, staring room, the whispers erupting around her like the hissing of 1,000 snakes. In the space of 30 seconds, she had gone from the future Duchess of Beaumont to the fallen woman of the season. The all is lost. The silence Arthur had so desperately craved was now his tormentor. In the week that followed the ball, Beaumont House became a mausoleum, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall a hammer blow counting the seconds of his hollow, self-inflicted victory. He had done it. He had saved her. He had cut her out of his life with surgical precision, leaving her free to find a simple, warm happiness with a better man. He had acted with honor. So why did honor feel exactly like damnation? He took his meals alone in the vast, empty dining room. He read reports in his study, the words blurring into meaningless shapes on the page. He had his freedom, the solitude he had always prized, and he had never felt more imprisoned. He was a ghost in his own life. The breaking point came in the form of his grandmother. The Dowager Duchess entered his study without knocking, her back as straight as the cane she wielded more for effect than necessity. She stood before his desk, her eyes the same sharp, intelligent blue as his own, filled not with sympathy, but with a cold, clear fire. "You are a fool, Arthur," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "A bigger fool than your father ever was." He stiffened. "I did what was necessary." "Necessary," she scoffed, the sound like cracking ice. "You humiliated a good, strong woman in front of the entire world, and you call it necessary? You call your own cowardice honor?" "I saved her from a life with me," he countered, his voice low and tight. "From the same fate that befell my mother." "Your mother," the Duchess said, her voice softening just a fraction, "faded because your father was a proud, frightened man who received the gift of a passionate, loving wife and did not have the courage to accept it. His sin was not a lack of a heart. It was the pride and fear that made him refuse to use it." She took a step closer, her eyes boring into him. "You have just made the exact same mistake, only worse. You didn't save that girl. You punished her for showing you a happiness you were too cowardly to claim." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow, shattering the twisted logic of his noble sacrifice. She was right. He hadn't saved Leonora. He had simply repeated the sins of his father, hiding behind a wall of duty and fear. He had seen a life of warmth and light, and, terrified it would be extinguished, he had snuffed it out himself. The profound, agonizing truth settled upon him. His true prison was not a loveless marriage. It was this, a life without Leonora. He had to get her back. Leonora was packing. In the drawing room of the townhouse they could no longer afford, she and Francis were carefully wrapping what little remained of their family's heirlooms in tissue paper. They were to retreat to the country, to live a quiet life of genteel poverty. Their season in London having ended in the most spectacular and humiliating way imaginable. Her mother had taken to her bed, too ashamed to face the world. There was a sudden commotion in the hall. A flustered butler appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide. "My lady," he stammered, "His Grace, the Duke of Beaumont, is here." Leonora's heart stopped. She stood up, dusting her hands on her apron, her face a pale, calm mask. "Tell His Grace that I am not at home." "I'm afraid that will not be possible," came a deep voice from behind the butler. Arthur stood in the doorway. He was not the immaculate, imperious duke she knew. His cravat was slightly askew, his hair was wind-swept, and his eyes were filled with a raw, desperate vulnerability that she had never seen before. He ignored the butler, her sister's protective glare, everything. He only looked at her. "Leonora," he said, his voice hoarse. He walked into the center of the room, stopping a few feet from her. "What I am about to say, I deserve to say to a room full of people so they can witness my shame. But I could not wait another second to say it to you." He took a deep breath, the sound shuddering. "I was wrong. Everything I did, everything I said. It came from a place of profound, selfish fear. I was a coward." He looked around the room, at the half-packed crates, at the visible signs of her ruin, his ruin. I was so terrified of becoming my father that I became something infinitely worse. A man who destroys the one good, beautiful thing in his life and calls it honor. He stepped closer, his gaze pleading. "There was never a bargain, Leonora. Not for me. I told myself it was, because it was safe, because it was controllable. But from that first moment in the cottage, from that first honest conversation, it was real. Every moment since has been real. I was just too blind and too broken to admit it." His control finally crumbled. Tears welled in his eyes, stark and shocking against his stoic face. And then, the Iron Duke, the most powerful man in England, sank to one knee before her on the worn Aubusson carpet. Francis gasped. "I am not offering you a title or a contract," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked up at her. "That man is gone. I am asking, no, I am begging for you, for your forgiveness, for your heart, if you will still have mine, which has been yours all along." He held out his hand, not with the command of a duke, but with the plea of a supplicant. "Will you, Leonora Scott, do me the incredible, undeserved honor of being my wife? My real, true, and only Duchess?" Leonora stared down at him, at this magnificent, broken man who had shattered her world and was now offering to rebuild it, piece by painful piece. She saw the truth in his eyes, the raw, unguarded love he had tried so hard to deny. The soldier in her, the pragmatist, faded away, leaving only the woman who loved him. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed for a week finally fell, tracing paths down her cheeks. "Get up, you fool," she whispered, a watery, trembling smile touching her lips for the first time. He rose slowly, searching her face, his heart in his eyes. She stepped forward, closing the space between them, and placed her hand in his. "Yes, Arthur," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes." He pulled her into his arms, his embrace, not one of passion or possession, but of profound, breathtaking relief, like a man who had been drowning and had just found air. He kissed her then, a kiss of promises made, of ghosts banished, and of a love that had been tested by fire and had, miraculously, survived. In the quiet, dusty drawing room, surrounded by the ghosts of her past, Leonora Scott finally found her future. The pews of St. George's, Hanover Square, were filled to capacity. The entire ton had turned out, their curiosity peaked to a fever pitch. They had all been present for the scandalous end. They would not miss the miraculous beginning. Leonora saw them all as she walked down the aisle on the arm of a tearfully proud young lord who was a distant cousin. She saw the gossiping matriarchs, the society dandies, and in a front pew she saw Lord Lawrence, who met her gaze and gave a small, genuinely happy nod. He was a good man, and she wished him nothing but the best. but she only had eyes for the man waiting for her at the altar. It was not the Iron Duke who stood there. It was Arthur. The rigid control was gone, replaced by an expression of such raw, unguarded adoration that it made her heart ache with happiness. His eyes, the same ones that had been empty and cold at their engagement ball, were now shining with unshed tears. As she reached him, he took her hand, his thumb stroking hers in a gesture that was both a comfort and a promise. The ceremony was a beautiful, reverent blur. The only thing that felt real was the low, steady sound of his voice as he spoke his vows, and the firm, warm grip of his hand in hers. Later, at the wedding breakfast in the grand ballroom of Beaumont House, the very room where he had broken her, the happy couple took their seats at the head table. The Dowager Duchess looked on with an expression of profound satisfaction. Frances, now with a dowry that made her one of the most eligible ladies of the coming season, was beaming. When the time came for the toast, Arthur stood. A hush fell over the room. Every guest leaned forward, eager to hear what the Duke, who had once given the most scandalous speech of the decade, would say now. He raised his glass, but he did not look at the crowd. He looked only at his wife. "My lords, ladies, and gentlemen," he began, his voice clear and strong, "I am aware that our path to this day has provided the ton with more speculation than a change in government." A few polite, nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Many of you were present some months ago, in this very room, when my own fear and foolish pride led me to commit an act of profound and public cruelty against the woman I loved more than my own life. A collective intake of breath. The admission was stunningly direct. "I spoke then of arrangements and purposes," Arthur continued, his voice growing thick with emotion. "I was a fool. A blind man who was terrified of the light. The only purpose of that time was for me to learn what it was to truly see. And the only arrangement was that of my own heart, which had arranged itself to belong entirely to Leonora Scott from the moment I first saw the strength and fire behind her eyes." He turned his body fully toward her, the rest of the room fading away. "I stand here today as a husband, not because of my title or my fortune, but because of this woman's infinite capacity for grace and forgiveness. She saw the man behind the fool, and, against all reason, against all logic, she chose to save him from himself. She is my honor, she is my strength, and she is my heart." He raised his glass high, his eyes now shining freely with tears. "So I ask you to join me. To my wife, my Duchess, my compass and my home. To Leonora." The room erupted in a roar of, "To the Duchess!" Lord Lawrence was among the first on his feet, his glass raised high with a genuine smile. Later, as the orchestra began to play a waltz, Arthur came to Leonora's side. He gently took her hand and led her to the center of the floor for their first dance, as husband and wife. "Was that a more acceptable speech, Your Grace?" he murmured, his eyes twinkling as he pulled her close. Leonora leaned her head against his shoulder as they began to move, the scent of his cologne and the solid feel of his heart beating against hers, the only reality she needed. "It will do," she whispered, a joyful, private smile gracing her lips. "But you have the rest of our lives to continue to make it up to me." "A task," he replied, kissing her softly, "to which I will devote my every breath."